State systems. So states are the autonomous political units with social strata and a formal government. The most formal political organizations, and it's one of the hallmarks of what we consider modern civilization. And what also defines states is the political power is centralized in a government, which may legitimately use to regulate the affairs of its citizens. States are commonly associated with, first of all, an increased food production, so large sort of agriculture and industry. And with that agriculture and industry comes an increased population, as well as a fixed territory, so sort of a fixed sort of national borders, a developed market system, an appearance of bureaucracy, so sort of appearance of a government structure, as well as the delegation of authority to maintain order, especially within and outside of its borders. States have a specialized units that perform specific tasks. The first one is population control. It's about fixing boundaries, establishing citizenship, and taking of a census. It's also about sort of regulating population, whether that's through health initiatives or whether that's through political means or even economic means. States have a specialized sort of role to control population. It also has sort of a judiciary role in which it creates laws, legal procedures, as well as sort of the structure of legal enforcement and regulation. So creation of the legal system. States also perform the work of enforcement through either military or police forces, the regulation of individuals. And the last thing that states perform is fiscal, so basically taxation. So taking the resources from individuals in order to keep on funding the other roles of the state. A big part of the state is about social control. So social control involves sort of direct and indirect things. So it can be the beliefs, practices, as well as institutions like education, like your education that you've gotten, that are involved in the maintenance of any sort of social norms and the regulation of those norms, as well as sort of the resolution of any conflict. And when we talk about social control, a word that usually comes up a lot is hegemony. And hegemony describes the domination of a culturally diverse society by a particular ruling class, who then manipulate the culture of the society, as well as, and that means like their beliefs, their explanations, their perceptions, their values, their social mores, so that within this, the ruling class view, sort of their way of how they see society and how they want to structure society, becomes the worldview of everyone, even the ones who are inferior to the ruling class, and is accepted as a cultural norm by everyone. Hegemony at its core, it's about internalizing a dominant ideology. There is a thing called cultural hegemony. And cultural hegemony is the idea or concept that one nation or culture, either by direct intent or merely by sort of its dominant position in the world, exerts an inordinate influence into how other cultures should conduct themselves, both in terms of value as well as sort of political and economic aspirations, as well as just sort of the day-to-day activities. So when we talk about cultural hegemony a lot, we talk a lot about the United States, and especially American cultural hegemony. The United States is in a uniquely sort of position about its sort of power over spreading American culture around the world, in a large part because the promotion of its social structure around the world is an inevitable byproduct of the expansion of sort of U.S. corporations as well as media into sort of emerging markets, like such as in South Asia and in Africa and in the Middle East. as well as sort of, far-reaching willingness to intervene into the military, into the affairs of these sort of developing states. American culture is also centered around very much the media. And in fact, as much as America as a state intervenes into a particular another state's business militarily or politically, it also intervenes through sort of the products that get sent over there, so Coca-Cola, McDonald's, as well as the movies, the big blockbusters. And that, particularly the media part, is an incredibly strong influence on the values of many communities outside of the United States. And many sort of people who are in these communities are trying to aspire to a more sort of consumer-based style, or at least a lifestyle that's promoted in American media. Oftentimes, American cultural hegemony is criticized and is seen as a negative light, as it has the potential to really suppress local cultural expression as well as beliefs and norms to a point where the diversity of that community is lost, and instead everybody wants to adopt an American lifestyle. The thing about cultural hegemony, or even hegemony, is that when we talk about trying to get a dominant belief being by a particular ruling class being sort of kind of seen as the social norm, we tend to think about it as like formal, as a way as like people are forcing you individually to believe their beliefs. But most of social control happens informally, that it's not sort of a direct action by someone. And particularly, the way that we think about, even within our own community, about gender or race, the way that we sort of socially control individuals happens a lot of times by informal gestures, the everyday interactions that we do. So the looks that we give people on the streets, to the comments we make on Twitter and Facebook. And also through the processes of shame, right, where we shame individuals. So that's sort of external sanctions against an individual. So like, have you no shame, or you should be ashamed of yourself. That's very much us sort of sanctioning an individual. But that sort of shame and sort of sanctioning is also internal. Like, I feel guilty, I feel like at fault, or I feel wrong. Again, all of these are sort of external and internal control. And this becomes a particular problem, especially for people who are really working hard to fight against racism, fight against sexism, homophobia, ageism, you name it. Being that, social control and sort of very negative sort of beliefs happen both formally and informally. And it's the informal part that is still a struggle for many people in American society to change. So when trying to change or dismantle particular kinds of social control, such as racism, sexism, or homophobia, it's often challenging because social control is both formal and informal. So stopping racism is not only about changing formal social control, so such as when we dismantled the Jim Crow laws or segregation of public services or schools in the South, but it's also about dismantling informal social control. So getting, really confronting everyday sort of subtle racism that happens, whether it's the looks on the street, to comments made by people passing by, to just sort of the really sort of indirect ways that racism works. And we're going to be talking much more about racism as well as sexism and all of that in our later chapters. But it's important that when we're talking about social control and sort of the power of the elites and all of that, is that social control is not monolithic, meaning that wherever there is social control, whether that's formal social control through the state or informal through like our everyday interactions, there is always resistance. even in the sort of the most extreme situation, so such as open conflict, or you're literally in the middle of a war zone, people do have the power to act. The choices individuals have in extreme situations, like being in an open conflict area, are definitely very limited, but you still can't sort of take away that person's agency and say that they aren't an actor, that they're just sort of actionless and victimless. People do make choices, and it's important to remember agency in any situation. It's also especially important when we talk about violence against particular communities, such as, the violence against First Nations, Native American communities, or violence against African American communities here in the United States. We can't talk about that violence, and we can't talk about that violence without recognizing the amazing sort of resistance and agency and incredible strength these communities have to fight against, their oppression. So, again, we can talk about sort of the violence against these communities, but we also need to recognize their agency in fighting and preserving their own culture and their communities. You need to have both. Oftentimes, though, I think the thing is that when we think about resistance, I think we really think about it in a large scale, like such as, something where like people are off in the masses in the streets and protesting, and that's definitely a form of resistance and something to be admired. But resistance can be very subtle, meaning that, you can resist whether it's oppressive regimes to oppressive ideology to anything in between there, by just sort of your everyday little actions that you do. Resistance can be very small, and it can also be limited to an individual. When we're looking at communities, we should also look at the small little ways that people resist, whatever sort of oppression or sort of social control that is enforced onto them. And look at, again, everyday resistance, which are the small acts that people do to challenge social control. And that's particularly important for Native American communities here in the United States. That for many Native American groups in the United States, preserving their culture and their language, despite decades of oppression by the American state, by the American government, is a way to resist sort of American hegemonic cultural hegemony, as well as American colonization and the destruction of their land and cultural communities. Despite many attempts by the U.S. government to displace indigenous communities by forcing them off their lands and taking their children away to residential schools, Native American communities continue to work hard in preserving their communities and their language and their cultural heritage for generations to come. So again, it's about recognizing both sort of the violence against these communities, but as well as the agencies of these communities to resist this violence. Okay, so this is the end of the lecture, and we're going to get to the key terms. So first, again, states. It's the autonomous political units with social strata and a formal government. Social control are the beliefs, practices, and institutions that are most actively involved in maintenance of any norms and the regulation of any conflict. And hegemony, the internalization of dominant ideology. Okay, see you next class.